those figures are obviously shocking, the difference. Now, interestingly, as I mentioned, obviously the carbon footprint of the two is significantly different, and that doesn't take a scientist to figure that one out. And no disrespect to those of you in the room who are scientists, but there are a number of other differences, on the other hand, that actually make me believe that the adoption rate over the next 10 years may end up being way higher for trucks and buses than it is for vehicles. So let me just explain a few, and then the challenges of infrastructure, of charging infrastructure also. So the reason why the adoption rate may be much higher is it's fleets making decisions. And so right now we're in fleets testing. We call it alpha beta scale. And at this stage, pretty much all the fleets are in alpha. So they're buying 1, 2, 5, 10, 15 maximum, and they're testing. For example, we just delivered the first 15 fully electric delivery trucks to Amazon in San Diego. They've said, we'll test 15, but within the next 5 years, we want to deploy 120,000 of them. So, okay. Rather scary in a way, but they're only an example. So the fleets have that ability and that rational approach. And there's another thing with fleets, and we're looking mainly at what I call urban last mile. Now, that is obviously urban last mile delivery, which we all abuse of more and more as we click away on Amazon on other sites. And there's been articles about how that is affecting cities across the US with congestion and increased pollution. So there's that, but what people, so it's urban delivery and suburban, and then also shuttle buses, which have very similar driving patterns. But the biggest thing that everyone misunderstands, and one of the reasons it's going to push early adoption on the delivery side, is the average miles driven by a UPS or FedEx or whatever is only 42 miles a day. So where all of you have range anxiety when you go and buy a Tesla, because you want, now I want to go skiing this weekend, and am I going to get there and back? Well, with a UPS delivery truck, it's pretty reliable. It's pretty much the same amount every day. So that whole range anxiety, which is one of the big inhibitors of growth of electric vehicles, when you go to the commercial vehicles, it's not an issue. And it's 42 miles on average, and it's the same number of miles almost every day. So the combination of fleets and that much more reduced range problem really makes that the electric vehicles are very much better suited to commercial vehicles. Now, then we come to the infrastructure side, and I will admit, we often have customers who buy vehicles from us, and then afterwards they come back 2 weeks later and they say, oh, by the way, how am I going to charge this vehicle? So it's kind of like, this is going to be interesting. Now, there are customers on the other hand, and I'll put Amazon among them, and UPS and the big boys, who actually have big teams analyzing how they're going to charge and looking at the whole infrastructure. So there are, extreme differences from customer base. But if we look at it, there's one big advantage in this commercial charging, which is pretty much we can go with a depot charging method, meaning it is that there is no, when we look, one of the speeches I heard on Monday was all about how Uber is using these DC fast charging stations in California, and all of a sudden 30% of the charging used in those public stations is taken by Uber and Lyft. Well, in this case, the most logical charging, especially in package delivery, happens back at the depot and during the night. Most package deliveries run one shift. It may be a 12-hour shift, but it's still one shift, so they're back at the depot. But then the challenge comes, and for those of you involved with the utility, one of the problems we have to solve is, okay, so now I have 150 vehicles at that depot, and I want to charge them during the night. I know that your substation is not capable of giving me the power I need to charge 150 vehicles overnight. So that's one of the big challenges, is how do we get the grid to be able to enable that kind of concentrated charging. So I know that some of the people are looking at microgrids being combined with a grid. So here Here in Boulder, for example, we repowered a city bus for Boulder. So this was a Class 7 Gillig city bus, 12-year-old bus where we took out the diesel drivetrain and put in an electric one. And they're powering it half by a solar array on the roof. So they've created a solar array plus battery plus the grid. So they kind of combine the two, and in that way they deal with it. But that can work for 2, 3, 4, 5 buses, but once they get to their whole 20 buses, that mix isn't going to work. So yeah, there is the challenge of, you know, how do we deal with charging of concentrated fleets that have to, you know, charge a big fleet overnight. So that's something I'd love to throw at you guys, and if we could find a solution for that is going to be one of the big inhibitors of electrification of urban fleets.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor up for questions.
Is your microphone? Speak loudly.
Shout. We'll repeat the question.
Yeah, there should be. You know what? You could take one of the take one of these. But we're videotaping. We're videotaping, so you can.
Oh, you're videotaping?
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Andrew Dowdy with Engineers Without Borders, and I find this to be really interesting because currently we're looking at a very early stages. We're actually promoting a design competition for affordable off-grid refrigeration, and this is targeting the base of the pyramid. We're trying to sell refrigerators or figure out a way to provide refrigeration to the poorest people on the planet, essentially. And so we have some philanthropy funding right now, we're just in a proof of concept stage right now, and we're trying to see if we can develop some innovative technology. My question is, if we're successful, which still remains to be seen, we would like to move ultimately into production stage prototypes and ultimately in commercial deployment, because that's the only thing that makes sense. And so I guess my question is, in that deployment, what's the role, say, between VC and philanthropists, and I think we have philanthropic funding right now, and maybe impact investors? I mean, how do you see those different parties, and I think they all have different objectives, and how do they play in an ultimate commercial deployment to get something across, you know, the valley of death? Thank you.
It's something relevant, I think, for all three of us up here. And in fact, Ambassador Perry and I were just talking about this just before the panel. I couldn't remember. Some friend of mine was working on something similar. So solar power to support a refrigerator in a village in Africa where there was otherwise no refrigerator to store medicines primarily and other things. And I think I jumped right in before the other two. You actually probably start with these two gentlemen.
Go ahead, Greg.
And then once it reaches commercial scale, then we can do something. Our investors aren't going to let us proceed until there's a real equity backstop. But something like that, I think, would be of interest as well for support, export credit, and the sorts of institutions that Ambassador Perry was mentioning.
I think the Development Finance Corporation, once they get up and running, you can approach them from technical assistance as well as grant funding in terms of an equity stake gives you that cash now as you build out and can build a platform to then draw in more money later on from other sources in different structures.
So, as I mentioned earlier, most of the money we've raised in Aravaipa came from impact investors. So that's a community that I know pretty well, and I'm actually invested personally in a project in Africa called Jibu, which is a urban water, clean water solution through franchising in Africa, and they've now got 120 franchisees in starting in Rwanda and branching out from there. So what I can say is that impact investors are definitely one way to do it, and impact investors have funded a lot of projects in Africa over the last 5 years. So that's a whole new category that wasn't available before. One thing not to forget is what we say, the interesting thing for those who understand impact investing from a family office point of view or from someone who does it in a more systemic point of view than just a single one is doing an impact investment is like, if the smart people look at it like a donation that I may get back. So it's kind of like, yeah, and I could give a grant or a donation, but instead I'll do an impact investment, because if I get it back, I can donate it again, I can make it again. So it's recyclable donations, and that's what people like about it, who historically were just doing donations. The notion of being able to, if it's successful, getting their money back and putting it someplace else in there. Now, I don't think a lot of people are yet at that second stage, because it really has only been active in the last 5 years. Does that answer your question a bit?
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Victor Del Carpio from Bureau of Economic Geology. So we have seen many presentations that will give you an idea of how the energy mix is going to evolve. So I want to know if you have any thoughts on the investment energy mix, and if it's correlated, as you see, on the same evolution. Is going to evolve in the same way as is being predicted that the energy mix is going to evolve. How much is based on returns? How much is based on more philanthropic or ideological thoughts, like we want, for example, to invest more in technology that it's climate change, that will help climate change? Thank you.
If you start, I'll jump in.
Yeah, I think there's levels, meaning I think the very high risk initial investments, which VCs have historically done, and angels and family offices have done, we play a role in that very early risk. But if we don't manage to take something and de-risk it over time to then bring in money like Greg's, the project will never be successful, because it has to transition from that very high risk to acceptable risk for institutions or bigger players to participate. So there's a chain there, and each player in the chain is equally important, because if we can't hand it off to someone at the next level, the amount of money available in the early stage isn't enough. There's so much more available at the level where Greg plays. So it's kind of you have to take the companies up these steps, and as you gradually go up the steps, you gradually have it. And each new technology has that requirement. Does that make sense?
The good news is that the good ideas do ultimately win out. So the sorts of capital that we can access for large-scale investment, brave people like Robert and his investors have beaten a path to our door ultimately for those projects. So renewables generally you could take as a huge example, where all the subsidy was so important, going back 30 years, that governments were desperate to push that. People are bidding to build $2 billion offshore wind farms with zero subsidy now. And power prices in California are negative during when the sun is out. So that sort of, people couldn't imagine that you'd be doing that now. So I think for good technologies and electric vehicles, this meeting I have in London next week, these guys that are going to do 50 megawatt batteries, they're located at great locations on the UK grid, and part of their project is to have a private wire to support electric vehicle charging. So I'm looking forward to getting an update on that, because my partners so far have said, great, we're going to do it, but not yet. So I want to be at the front edge of that. But the good news is, and as I was saying, I want us to be financing the infrastructure of tomorrow. So as soon as some of these things are financeable at our higher yield, so it doesn't have to be something that the bank would support, then I think they will, if they've been proven and it makes sense, they will attract financing on the scale to deploy nationally, globally.
The grants are important. It's great talk about they are important in early stages.
Let me just add a comment in terms of public policy and the role that governments can play in the U.S. The state of Virginia, it passed a law several years ago requiring Dominion Power to move towards renewables. Just in the past month, the governor decided he's going to require all state agencies to use renewable. That will help Dominion meet somewhere between 30 to 40% of that goal. It also sets an example for corporations operating in the state. But I think it would become, over time, difficult for a large corporation that goes to the state for support on something to not then participate in meeting renewable goals passed by the legislature and enforced by the government. So it's a matter of public policy, vision, having the power, the political power and the financial power to dictate how your operation is going to fuel itself. There's another problem on Virginia, and that's a pipeline. And so Dominion cooperating on renewables may soften the political opposition to build a pipeline to bring power, gas from West Virginia and Pennsylvania across the state to get to export on the coast. So a lot of politics involved in that also.
I'm going to do it without standing up. I think everybody hear me okay?
Well, it's taped, so I just want to be sure it gets taped.
Well, you can repeat it. How about that?
Yeah.
So you each represent or discussed, I would call it pretty traditional views of how your business or your coalition fits in, I'll call it the financing ecosystem of the past and current. And you each deal with different risk reductions. I'm at NREL. We work with Aravaipa and tech companies to de-risk technologies. And you're on the venture side. You know, Craig, you look for risks that are tolerable, and then there's all sorts of risks with, I'll call it other country assets and technology investment. And my question to each of you is, if we're going to move $4 or $5 trillion into clean energy investment, what needs to be done differently that's not done today? Tina, I don't know if you want to repeat that.
So if I understand you correctly, what needs to be done differently going forward in order to move, in order to promote the clean energy transformation, which may require as much as $4 or $5 trillion of investment?
Can I throw it back at the ambassador? Because, you know, the one thing that definitely does work, so, you know, among the tools of government that we live with is we have on the one side grants, and then we have on the other side regulation. And quite honestly, give me regulation every day. Yeah. So what we need is city councils to have the balls to go out and say, from tomorrow on, I will only allow zero-emission trucks and buses in my town. And by the way, that costs the city council absolutely zero. Zero cost to the city council. They just pass it, and they pass it down, and that gets the ball rolling. So I don't know, Ambassador. I throw you the ball. I'd love more regulation. Now, I'm a European, so I'm allowed to say that in the U.S. without getting shot. Yeah?
I think that the regulation is important because it sets the parameters, the rules of the game for investors on one side, and then for consumers on the other side to know what to expect. I was sort of disappointed in your answer about the identification of the problem for municipal transportation and delivery transportation in terms of not having the battery storage to recharge at night.
But that will solve that.
Yeah.
If you give us the regulation, we'll solve that. That's we've got NREL and other smart people in this room who can solve the technical problem. The technical problems are easy to solve.
Yeah, it's the policy side.
It's the policy side, yeah. It feels like a cloud with...
I'm glad Virginia has done what it has with Dominion power in the state. I hope other states pick that up in terms of how their agencies, where they get their power, what type. And maybe it will set an example for the federal government.
I just add to that. So, risk allocation certainly between public and private sector, and figuring out which risks the private sector doesn't control. Regulation, of course, being one, and that's sort of support of emerging technology in the early days when it needs it. Hopefully, tapering off once it's proven and financeable by people like our investors. I think I would add to the regulation. What's very key for us is the stability of that regulation. So I was speaking with a gentleman here who's based in Calgary, and he was telling me about the capacity market there, where government comes in and they say, great, we're going to introduce capacity market. By the time they're about to implement it, the government changes. No, we're not doing that. And I'm speaking out of school. I'm not an expert. I just thought that was an interesting example. But Spain and Italy changed. They retroactively changed the tariffs for renewables, and people like us were horrified. So that's it. We're not supporting projects in those countries anymore. I mean, I am actually invested in a Holdco Italian renewables project, and so that did change. But it's the stability and the predictability that we really need, and it is up to the public sector to provide. I mean, of course, they have to evolve with the time, but to try and provide a stable environment so that investors are comfortable supporting that 4 to 5 trillion that we need to invest in these new types of energy.
Yeah, and just the price of oil obviously is a huge destabilizer for all clean tech projects where they interact with the oil, which is not necessarily power. No, but for example, in transportation, it plays a huge role.
So I'm Charles Paris with Bohm, and kind of going along with that, it sounds like there's a big need for regulation to provide clear direction for investment. What is your take on some more like an economic incentive direction? So something like a carbon tax or something to give a price signal for what technologies might win out in the end. What are your opinions on something like that?
Well, I was having a conversation about this with somebody much more knowledgeable about this than me, saying that sort of carbon tax was generally considered to be a really efficient and effective means. Now, there are academics here better versed in that topic than me, but I think the relevance for us would be that if it's a stable, if we're financing companies and that's part of what they're looking at, and that's built into the mix. I'm glad to hear that the experts consider that to be a effective means to achieve our social goals that we share in common of reducing our carbon footprint. That's sort of a waffly answer. Maybe you could do.
No, I can just say that obviously in the clean tech community, you won't find many people who don't believe that carbon taxation is the right thing to do. So from that, it just, the externalities of not having it are just, don't make sense from anyone who's trying to solve the problem.
I will express some skepticism based on looking at the legislative decision-making on anything like carbon tax, particularly since we have not raised the federal gasoline tax since I think it's 1992.
So let's raise that one.
That should be the easy thing to do.
Yeah.
Some states have done it, and that will set, you raise that tax, and then it makes renewables more competitive with gasoline, while at the same time helping reduce the carbon footprint. But it just takes that...
and it should be a lot easier to do than carbon taxation.
Yeah.
A lot simpler as a process, yeah.
And you also have the thing in transportation, the transition from gas tax to usage tax when you get more electric vehicles, because the state still needs to collect money to build the roads, which is not being done.
But politically, the carbon tax would be easier than the gasoline tax, because gasoline tax you see every time you go to the pump.
Yeah.
The carbon tax,
you don't.
On the other hand, in Europe, we've lived with huge gasoline taxes forever, and it works just fine.
Go ahead, John.
I'm John Holding, independent analyst, which actually means I'm retired, and I was with Chevron International upstream for 28 years, and Ambassador Bob has probably teed me up for this question. From 2003 to 2010, I was involved in Nigeria in upstream activities. I was resident there for 4 years. And during that time, we were not only, of course, with Chevron producing oil in the Delta and the offshore, but we were involved in the investigation of 2 LNG projects, the Brass LNG project and the OK LNG project, and I was involved in both of those. These, of course, would be mega projects to put the flares out, and they would be probably each of the order $30–40 billion at the time, including a fleet of LNG carriers, of course. We had a partnership, of course, and obligatory partner was the National Oil Company, NNPC, Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation. The question relates to an aspect of political risk. So, of course, in the initial feasibility stages, then moving into preliminary engineering in order to scope out a higher quality capital cost estimate. So really for several years, this sort of initial work, relatively low cost, but all paid by the partners. And of course, each project would be project financed at the end of the day, given the scale of it. But even in the early years, to get the funding from the state oil company for their participation was very difficult. It delayed the projects, to be honest, and it really was a frustrating issue, you know, their budget cycle, our budget cycles, etc. So it was a real difficulty, and it's really, I think, one example of perhaps the bigger one of how do you deal with that type of political risk. Thank you.
I suppose it's something that the amount of the risk involved in that size project is difficult to offset with any U.S. government help. You get some financial offset, but not much. It's just an awareness of the political environment that you're operating in, and trying to have faith that it will get better in the future. I visited Nigeria many times between 2003 to 2016, talking with Chevron, Exxon, Shell, primarily about their challenges in dealing with NNPC and partnerships. So I understand and feel your pain. Let me just ask, how did it turn out?
The shells, because they were not financially viable.
Yeah.
Capital costs too much relative to the scale of the projects.
For the rest of the audience, to understand that Nigeria has very low cost natural gas, probably lower cost, I believe, than most places in the U.S., as well as most producers globally. However, the political insecurities in the Delta region there has some impact on the ability to do that type of project, as well as just the political uncertainties in dealing with the government on being sure that when the bill comes to due, that it's paid, that the other partner at the table pays also. And the oil companies found that challenging over a number of years.
We find, well, among my partners and I, we just find it impossible to accurately assess and gauge political risk. The jurisdictions that we're active are U.S., Canada, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. Having said that, you've got Jeremy Corbyn leading the Labour Party, who wants to renationalize all the utilities and the railroads. So, political risk. The UK has definitely demonstrated that its political system is not as stable as we all probably expected. But nonetheless, that's why I'm actually working on a project. I have a meeting on Friday. It's undersea fiber optic cable that's going to connect to some jurisdictions that are of interest to the U.S. It also avoids the South China Sea. That's definitely of interest to the U.S. So it will have support, I'm told, of OPIC, and I only learned now that it's no longer OPIC, it's the U.S. IDFC. So they probably would have told me that on Friday, but I'm looking forward to learning more about that. But if I'm able to get my partners backing to do this project, and even though it touches in jurisdictions that were not permitted, it originates in the U.S., my getting them comfortable will be because an institution like U.S. IDFC is giving us some cover on that political exposure.
I have a follow-up question for Ambassador Bob. Since you were Vice President of the Corporate Council of Africa, and you work closely with the Nigerian Ministry of Power Works and Housing on its power sector reforms, can you tell us about this reform program and how the USG helped?
Okay, so Nigeria has the largest population in Africa. It's a major oil and gas producer, yet its power sector in terms of providing power was something suited to the 1940s and 50s. So starting around 2000, the president, with the support of government, decided they needed to invest in this and change. So they went through a step-by-step process of power sector reform, including separation of generation, transmission, and distribution, privatizing different parts of that. They kept transmission as a government and privatized generation and distribution. I think the American companies that went into the generation side of it, the government was the off-taker under established 10 to 20-year contract. So that was a relatively stable investment. The people that went into distribution, that was it was a higher risk investment because you don't have an established off-taker. You have a prepaid residential system or individual companies buying your power, but you were never quite sure that everything would be paid on time. Also, if you were an American company or a Nigerian company in partnership and you took $1 or pound loan to set up the infrastructure for your company to do this, and then the Nigerian currency collapses 50% over a course of 12 months, you have a real financial problem. And that's what has happened to make that distribution side of it relatively difficult. Just so happens I have a meeting on Monday with a friend who is a consultant to one of the distribution companies to talk about how the options she sees for advising them how to restore their solvency, more or less. But the U.S. put in advisors into the ministry to help them through ARD, and the government has made a lot of the right policy choices, but implementation is still problematic.
Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you. Since we have a moment of time, I'm a researcher at NREL, but since we have a moment of time, I'll ask this question. A lot of the clean tech investments I heard you all talk about were renewables, gas, transportation. I think there's one industry that has been pretty insulated from innovations in investment, and that's like nuclear. If you look in the United States, like Vogtle is kind of a financing nightmare, and when you talk to SMR developers, they're all excited about rural Africa applications, but I think they're not even talking about how you would finance such a situation when there's been such a struggle even to put renewable energy there to like channel, to have de-risking renewable investments. And so I was just wondering what you thought in terms of like an industry that is ripe for innovation on financing that is technology specific. I was reading some of their papers, and I'm like, you're not even like looking at some of these new investment models. So I was just wondering what you thought were innovation opportunities for investment paired specifically with large nuclear timescales that are happening.
I would like for us to do nuclear power. I have discussed it with my partners. We haven't seen an opportunity yet, with the exception of, and that's to your point, nobody's coming to us and asking us to fund it. We are an investor in a company called Excelsium. Excelsium, and I learned a wonderful, my French is not very good, but Excelsium is intended to provide electricity to electro-intensive, it's a single word, electro-intensive industries. Excelsium basically was a means to get power, nuclear power, into steel mills. ArcelorMittal, I think, is the biggest user, and other big industries. So that's as far as we've gotten, and it's a creature of contracts. So, we're not secured over the power plant. We're secured over contracts that allow these companies to basically prepay and be guaranteed nuclear power. That's as far as we've gone, and I think you're right, and thank you for making the point. Something I'll take away, that we're not, if we're ignoring nuclear's contribution to reducing our carbon footprint, then we're not really being as proactive as we like to think we are. And all of our investors, and certainly the chairman of the board of my fund, are all over us about, well, in the UK it's ESG, environmental social governance, but to reduce our carbon footprint and support the transition to clean energy.
Yeah, and there's unfortunately a very simple reason why I don't think the VC side of it is ever going to fund nuclear projects. Is just the timeline. They want most of them want a 5-year return, so and therefore it's the timeline aspect of it just doesn't. And I know at the NREL Growth Forum about 10 years ago or so, there was a nuclear project that was presented at the time. Was it right 10 years? I forget if it was 10 years ago or whatever. But there was one, and everyone talked, and there was a lot of talk in the corridors, and everyone just shrugged their shoulder and said, yeah, if our investors allowed us to take 20-year projects, this could be something we could consider. But given the time frames, just didn't match the asset class of VCs.
Well, if I can interject, on that one, the Breakthrough Ventures is one of the primary investors in NuScale, and that's because specifically their fund is a 20-year plus fund. Yeah. So that's an innovation that's happened in the VC space to allow them to align with some of the temporal profiles of clean energy technology. Yeah. So it doesn't fit your fund, but take a fresh look.
It doesn't fit mode. As I explained before, we were the first fund to extend to 15 years, 10 years ago. And so we believe in that lengthening of thing. But then, the other side of it, obviously, is it is relative. What you're looking at is relatively capital intensive. So, VCs have those two limitations generally. We don't want things that are too capital intensive and the timeline. So, nuclear kind of, doesn't meet either of those two boxes. So that's why I don't think, it's going to be a big VC activity area.
Any other questions? We're about out of time. Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you all very much.
Steal your market.
Oh, yes, fine.
Next time I have a credit committee on something where they're like, no, it's too risky.
I found that one a few years ago.
Mr. President,
Okay.
I'm retired of that, so.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Hey. Yeah. It just merged.
Yeah, the merger.
And they haven't gotten off the ground yet because we're still under continuing resolution. And since they just started this year, they didn't have a previous budget.
Oh, right.
And so people are still sort of sitting in offices but not doing too much.
Andrew, if I can think of my friend that was doing something similar, I'm assuming that you wouldn't view each other as competitors. You'd both be, I think it's a friend of mine from college, but I can check with her. Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely, sorry.
So what kind of parameters financially in terms of size?
So our ticket size for what we can lend is anything between 25, about 20 million and 65. Oh, did we do that?
Not to get a chance to get your cards, but I wanted to ask a question about your presentation.
Yeah.
Everybody was kind of asking really big picture questions, and I feel like this is a little smaller. You mentioned that the energy infrastructure investments have a higher resiliency compared to say, corporate or muni bonds.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, what is the source of that resiliency, and does it differ across projects?
So usually it's the corporates